It happens quite often that someone will come to Lars at the book table. They sort of sidle up to him and say, "Can I ask a personal question?" And he almost always knows what's coming. They want to know what he does with his self-image, with him at the back at the book table and his wife on the platform. Well, he has a very simple answer to that. He doesn't have to worry about it because he doesn't have one. The better answer, of course, which is what he may add, is that he knows his gifts and he acknowledges mine. He doesn't want to be on the platform. I don't want to be at the book table. So the Lord has given us the privilege and the fun of cooperating in what we do. But when I think of this endless discussion that we hear about self-image, it was a word that didn't exist when I was growing up, so I never had to worry about mine either, but now I've started to worry about it, and I look back. We're told that we're supposed to worry about it, aren't we? And I look back and I think, well, nobody could have had a worse self-image than I had and still have. I don't think it makes any difference. For example, I used to cry myself to sleep in the first grade because I was sure I was going to flunk. It got to the point where my mother went up to the school and had a conference with the teacher to find out if indeed my problems with arithmetic were serious. And the teacher told her that I was at the top of the class. I wasn't being modest or humble or silly. I was quite serious that I really did think that I was going to flunk. And that's just a sign of what has gone throughout my life. You can ask Lars about my dreams. I'm one of the world's wildest, vividest dreamers. And almost every one of them, in some way or other, would be an indication of the fear of failure to live up to expectations. So what else is new? I don't know whether there's anything unusual about that. Then I remember that we moved between 4th grade and 5th grade from Philadelphia to New Jersey. And it was in the 4th grade that the kids in New Jersey had learned to play softball. The school in Philadelphia required the learning of softball in the 5th grade. So I fell between both stools and ended up being expected to play softball when I had never been taught how to play it. So ask yourself who got chosen last on the team. Ask yourself who everyone expected would strike out, and she lived up to those expectations. I remember a time when I was staying in a very elegant hotel with my parents, one of those old-fashioned hotels that don't exist anymore, with palms in the lobby and a lot of old ladies sitting there with lorgnettes. Most of you are too young to know what a lorgnette is, but it was glasses that you snapped out on a handle and held them up when you needed them. And these little old ladies sat there and gazed at these children. It was very unusual to see children in the hotel, but there was one little girl who was a hellion. She was like, what's her name, Eloise, that lived in Plaza Hotel. I don't know if you know that book. But this little girl raced around and shouted and screamed and hollered and made everybody uncomfortable. And one day she raced the full length of the lobby to me and asked me how old I was. And I said 7. And she raced back the full length of the lobby screaming, "Granny, Granny, that great big girl over there is only 7 years old." Well, I stopped growing when I was 12 and I was 5 feet 9. And that's a trial for a child. So with one thing and another, not to mention a space between my teeth that I still have, I had a very poor self-image. But you know how I look at that kind of introspection and endless analysis? It's unnecessary baggage. What good does it do me to recognize that I had and have a poor self-image? What good would it do me to improve my self-image? I can't for the life of me think of one good thing that it would do. And so I think of how Jesus said that we were to forsake everything and follow him. And it seems to me that that's one of the things that I can very well do without, that unnecessary baggage. And there's a verse in one of Paul's epistles which says that we should be mentally stripped for action. And if I'm going to be lugging along all kinds of analyses of my psyche, I'm not going to be mentally stripped for action. I will not be free to serve other people. I will feel that I have a good many excuses for not serving them quite yet. Not until I get my self-image straightened out, not until I manage to work through all my feelings, or whatever else we're told nowadays by popular psychology that we're supposed to do. We're not to be preoccupied with ourselves at all. It is fruitless probing, and I really think we need to cut it out. Just quit. Well, how do we do that? We're talking in this series about offerings. And I would say that if a thing bothers you, if it's something that you are deeply concerned about, then like everything else in your life, it's meant to be offered up to God. And if your question to him is, what can you possibly do with this? What good is it? Remember the feeding of the 5,000. The little boy's lunch was certainly not very much when there were thousands of people there. But the point was that he gave it to Jesus. And Jesus received it in his hands and gave thanks to his Father for this humble, tiny offering and turned it into something for the good of a multitude. You may be asking the question, does God want it? Is it worth offering? And the answer is yes. What I offer to him is not in itself holy and acceptable. I offer to him a whole lot of things that are anything but holy. But it says in Romans 12, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable unto God. And I believe that the reason it can be called holy and acceptable is because it's offered. It is when the offering takes place that the transformation is worked out. It was when the little boy gave the lunch to Jesus, and Jesus took it into his hands and gave thanks, that it then provided food for a multitude. And so no matter what this thing is that we are bringing to God, let's remember that it is sanctified in its being offered, just as the lambs and the goats and the turtle doves that were brought as sacrifices to the tabernacle in the Old Testament were sanctified in their being offered. There was nothing special about them otherwise, except that they had to be perfect specimens. But it was very special when it was brought to the priest, and the priest received it into his hands and laid it on the altar. So we are talking this morning about my marital status and offering. First of all, let's think about singleness. I don't know about you, but I started out single. I was single for quite a long time, much longer than I thought I ought to be. I was 26 the first time I got married, and that meant that almost all of my friends had been married for 4 or 5 years by the time I was given a husband. And so I had to learn the lessons that God wanted me to learn within the context of singleness. We don't think very much about being single until we reach marriageable age and until we see our friends getting married and falling by the wayside one by one. But when we reach that age, then we begin to think very seriously about it, and what we used to call it at Wheaton was senior panic, when you got to the point of being in the senior class and had not found a husband in a Christian school where there was this enormous array of young Christian men. Where in the world were you ever going to find one? It was while I was a senior that I went through the painful business of facing the possibility of permanent singleness. I was going to be a missionary. I had not struggled over the decision to become a missionary. I was delighted when it became clear to me that that was indeed what God was calling me to do. But the idea of being a single missionary in Africa, I thought, was not appealing at all. And so I began to pray that God would show me whether he was going to give me a husband or not. And then I began to realize the absurdity of such a prayer. After all, Jesus makes it very plain that tomorrow is none of our business. Take no thought for tomorrow. Tomorrow will take thought for the things of itself. Seek ye first the kingdom of God. And so I realized that I had to direct my energies not toward finding a husband or hammering on heaven's door for an answer to that pressing question, but toward obedience, toward the kingdom of God. And so I finally came to the place where I said, Lord, if it's singleness that you want for me, I'll take it. It takes grace. It's not a natural response for most of us women, and I wouldn't want to imply that there's nobody here who is single who doesn't just love it. One time I did make a statement from the platform which implied that all women want to get married, and I certainly heard about it from a very angry female in the audience who told me that I had insulted her and all the other women who love their singleness. And I replied that I was simply stating an opinion, and in my mind it's nice to be married, but I wouldn't want to insult any of you. However, this was my desire, and so I laid it on the altar and said, Lord, here it is. I want you to do anything you want with me. And I prayed again that prayer that I gave you last night from Betty Scott Stam. Now it so happened that after I had prayed this amazingly bold prayer that I was willing to be single, God tested me. Should that be a surprise? God has to test the validity of our claims, doesn't he? And my claim was that I was willing to be single, or at least I was willing to be made single. But there wasn't any real live human being on my horizon at the time. In fact, it didn't look as though I had a chance in the world of ever being married. I had been a wallflower more or less through high school and college. And I was what we used to call a TWO on campus, just a teeny-weeny operator. But there were a lot of people, there were other people on the campus that we called BTOs, big-time operators. And one of the BTOs that I had been watching with great interest for a number of months by the time I prayed this prayer was a man by the name of Jim Elliott. He was very visible on the campus. He was a spiritual leader, president of the Foreign Missions Fellowship. He was an athlete, a champion wrestler. He had won the championship of 4 states. He had never been pinned in his life. They used to call him the India Rubber Man because they used to be able to tie him in unbelievable knots, but nobody ever pinned him. He was a clown, a campus clown that could be called upon at a moment's notice. Anytime people wanted entertainment, he would get up and recite Robert Service poetry, things like The Face on the Barroom Floor, or The Shooting of Dan McGrew, or The Cremation of Sam McGee. And to top it all off, besides being a spiritual leader, an athlete, and a clown, he was a scholar. And he graduated summa cum laude in classical Greek. I had written a list in the back of my diary when I was about 16 of the minimum qualifications for a husband. I don't remember exactly how many things there were on the list, maybe 18 or 19 things. And Jim Elliott seemed to fulfill almost all of them. He was not 6'4". He did not have an operatic baritone voice, but I decided that I'd be willing to settle for less than that. But all the girls that Jim seemed to be interested in were cute, outgoing, short, and sparkly. I was very plain, very introverted, extremely tall, and very dull. And so I didn't think there was the slightest chance that Jim Elliot would ever look at me. But to my absolute astonishment, just a few weeks before I graduated, he asked me if I would take a walk with him, and I consented. And we went for a walk, and he immediately confessed his love for me. He was assuming that I had some feelings for him, which I thought was rather presumptuous of him. I thought I had done an excellent job of covering up my feelings. If there were the only two rules that my mother ever taught me about sex were, number one, don't chase men, and number two, keep them at arm's length. Well, she needn't have bothered with number two because I had never got them within arm's length. But I did not chase them, and I was not about to reveal my feelings to any man unless he revealed his feelings to me. And so, as we walked, we talked about what it might be that God was teaching us through this. We discovered in a 7-hour conversation as we sat on the grass in a park that we had both been keeping spiritual diaries, that we had both gone through this same struggle at exactly the same time about being willing to be single. We had both come to the place of saying, yes, Lord, if that's what you want, I'll take it. And Jim had been given to understand that the work that he was planning to do in South America required single men. And so he had told the Lord that he would be willing to stay single for the rest of his life. And that was the stunning revelation that he gave me after he told me that he was in love with me. Instead of following that declaration by proposal, he said, it looks to me as though God may be asking me to remain single for the rest of my life. So he was in effect saying, see you around. Well, he wasn't going to see me around. I was graduating. He had another year to go. I lived in New Jersey. He lived in Oregon. I was going to Africa. He was going to South America. Period. Case closed. But one evening, we did take a few walks between that unforgettable day, which happened to be Memorial Day, and my graduation. And one evening, we wandered rather unwittingly into a cemetery, where we sat down on a convenient slab and talked some more about what God might be wanting to teach us through this. And I told Jim that I didn't think it made a whole lot of sense for us to tell God that we wanted him to handle the whole thing and then take it into our own hands to carry on a correspondence, which was what he had suggested we do. So I said, I really think we ought to just literally leave it in his hands and not correspond. And we sat in silence for quite a while. Jim didn't exactly leap at the suggestion. And then he said, you're right. I know you're right. Because this morning in my Bible reading, and Jim Elliot used to spend an hour before breakfast as a college student in Bible reading and prayer, he said the passage was the story of Abraham. And God asked of him the most precious thing he owned as an offering. And he said, I believed that God was asking that of me. You're that thing, and I put you on the altar. And he said, that's where you will stay, unless God stays my hand. I wrote a poem about that time. Hold thou thy cross between us, blessed Lord. Let us love thee. To us thy power afford to remain prostrate at thy pierced feet. There is no other place where we may meet. Set thou our faces as a flint of stone to do thy will. Our goal be this alone. O God, our hearts are fixed. Let us not turn. Consume all our affections. Let thy love burn. My marital status is a gift. Now, I had never thought about it that way until Jim Elliot pointed it out to me from 1 Corinthians 7. Paul had the gift of single life when he wrote that chapter. And it was very plain that he thought it was by far the best of all gifts. So whether he was a widower who had had a very unhappy marriage, we really don't know. But the fact was that he was single then, and he wished everyone else were single like him. But he did acknowledge that each one was to abide in the gift which God had given him. Now, we don't necessarily know that single life is a permanent gift. God may have something else up his sleeve tomorrow. But today, if we are single, then God has given us the gift of singleness. And what is it that we are meant to do with every gift that God gives to us? We are to offer it back, aren't we? But we cannot offer it until we have received it, until we have accepted it. And acceptance is a willed action. I open my hands and I say, yes, Lord, I'll take it. And I give thanks, as Jesus took the little boy's lunch. And he thanked his Father. He offered it up in thanksgiving. And that's what I must do with my singleness. It is yes to God. And Jesus gave 3 conditions for discipleship. If you want to be my disciple, you must give up your right to yourself and take up your cross and follow me. Giving up your right to yourself is saying no to yourself. Taking up your cross is saying yes to God. And those 2 things, I believe we have to do every day of the world. We are given those choices over and over and over again. Pray don't imagine for a moment that having made one seemingly major decision, that it's going to be a bed of roses from then on. The path winds uphill all the way, as Christina Rossetti says in her lovely poem. Does the road wind uphill all the way? Yes, to the very end. So that's for your encouragement, you young people. I can tell you that it winds uphill all the way, but we don't climb that hill alone. We are toiling up a steep hill with a very crooked stick. We're all pilgrims, but we're not alone. And so we had settled that question. Jesus Christ was Lord. Jesus Christ would be Lord of our love life. But, of course, the decision has to be tested again and again and again. And it would have been very nice if God had taken away my hunger, my sexual hunger, of which I discovered that I had what seemed to be an over amount. But he didn't do that. One lady came to me one time and she told me she'd had a terrible time trying to diet and trying to lose weight, and she said she'd been praying for years that God would take away her appetite. And she said for years she just was so angry at God because he didn't do that. And finally she said she shut up long enough to hear what he was saying to her, which was, if I did that, then what would you have to do? And so she realized that it had to be a willed action. God did not take away my hunger, and he explained why. In Deuteronomy 8, and this chapter was practically worn out in my Bible, and in every Bible that I've used since, because I have to keep going back to it. You must remember all that road by which the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, to humble you, to test you, and to discover whether or not it was in your heart to keep his commandments. He humbled you and made you hungry. Then he fed you on manna, which neither you nor your fathers had known before, to teach you that man cannot live on bread alone. And I don't think that it would be an irreverence to say man cannot live on sex alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Take this lesson to heart. The Lord your God was disciplining you as a father disciplines his son. For the Lord your God is bringing you to a rich land, a land of streams, of springs, and underground waters gushing out, and pomegranates, olives, oil, honey. It is a land where you will never live in poverty nor want for anything. When God led Israel to the promised land, he did not take them by the short route. He took them through the wilderness, where they had to suffer hunger. Why? So that he could scour the depths of their hearts to find out whether it was in their hearts to obey him. God has to make us hungry. There have to be unfulfilled longings, unanswered prayers, because it's the only way in the world that we're ever going to eat spiritual food. Do you understand what he's about? He gives me this gift of singleness, which I did not want. It is his gift in order to take me to that rich land where I'll never want for anything. But this is the route. Lord, does it have to be this way? And the answer is yes. There is no other way. The gift of singleness is meant to be an offering. I receive it with both hands. I say, yes, Lord. Thank you. And I give it back to him. And like every other sacrifice, he can transform that gift for the good of others. Now, what is the object of my offering? Is it in order that I may receive something else from God? No, it's an offering of love. The object of my offering is love, is Christ himself and my love for him. What I offer back to him is an offering of love. God's object in giving me that gift is, number one, so that I will have something to offer. Have you ever thought of your loneliness or your unfulfilled longings as material for sacrifice? Think of them that way. See if it doesn't transform your attitude. And the other reason why he gives me these things is to teach me to trust him and to obey him. In family prayers when I was a child, we learned hundreds of hymns. We learned all the stanzas. And one of the ones that we sang was Trust and Obey. Very simple gospel hymn, and the chorus says, trust and obey, for there is no other way. To be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. And we said in the first talk that fulfillment is not to be my goal. Let's get that very clear. My goal is not fulfillment. My goal is God himself. As I worship and lift up my heart and present my offerings, strangely and miraculously, as a byproduct, I find fulfillment. Let's think a little bit about my marriage as my offering. The single woman always feels that the grass is greener on the other side of the fence. She looks on the married women as women who've got everything. And she thinks that her loneliness would be solved by marriage, that she would be fulfilled if only she had a husband, somebody to sleep with. That's the way I felt. But I'm here to tell you, in case you didn't hear it anywhere else, I've had 3 husbands, godly men, every one of them, Christians, fine husbands. In fact, one woman, one of the few people in the world who knew all 3 of them, she said to me, you know, God has given you 3 princes. But you know what? Not one of those men could give me fulfillment. Because fulfillment lies only in God himself. Augustine said it hundreds of years ago. We are created with a God-shaped vacuum that nothing else can fill. And what the single woman can never imagine is that the married woman experiences a totally different and new kind of loneliness. Is that true? Yes. Because this man who you thought was going to fulfill all your needs and take the place of all your relationships and meet all your desires turns out to be what? Only a man. Nothing but a man. In my little book, Let Me Be a Woman, I have tried to remind women that what they marry is a man. They don't marry a woman. You know that old song from My Fair Lady, why can't a woman be more like a man? This man is saying, men are so reasonable, so easy to get along with. But let a woman in your life and your serenity is through. She'll redecorate your home from the cellar to the dome and go on to the enthralling fun of overhauling you. And we women, we shake our heads and we say, isn't that just like a man when he does something incomprehensible? And I say, thank God that what you got is a man. But he is also a sinner. And so he cannot possibly, by any stretch of the imagination, take the place of God. And so you have to experience a new kind of hunger and a new kind of longing and a new lack of fulfillment. Why? To test you, to humble you, to teach you that the Lord your God is disciplining you as a daughter, as a son, and in order to feed you on heavenly food. And if we were stuffed with the world's junk food, there's no way that we would ever learn to eat that heavenly food. Marriage is not fulfilling in itself. It is a gift from God. A gift, like every other gift from God, wisely chosen, precisely designed to suit my needs in learning to know God. It is a gift which I must receive with both hands, and I must do that again every day. I received my husband's before God and witnesses in the marriage ceremony. I said, yes, I will take this man to be my wedded husband. Cleave me only to him as long as we both shall live. I can remember the thrill of those words when I married Jim Elliott, and I thought, that's forever. Nothing but death can possibly separate us. And it was 27 months later that Jim was speared to death. And so God then gave me another gift, which I will come to in a moment. But I received this husband before God and witnesses at the altar, and then I must accept him every day of my life from then on. Accept who he is, who he isn't, his gifts, his lack of gifts. And I can assure you that having the perspective of a woman who's had 3, I know that Jim could do a lot of things that Ad couldn't do. Ad could do a lot of things that Lars can't do. Lars can do a whole lot of things that Jim and Ad together couldn't have done. And so I've been given an appreciation for the gifts that God has given. In fact, when Lars proposed to me, I wasn't at all prepared for an answer, because it was inconceivable to me that God could possibly want me to have a third husband. I, who was a one-man woman, I, who thought at first that I was going to be single the rest of my life. When I married Jim, I knew that there'd never be anybody else that could possibly measure up. And when my second husband died, I thought, well, that's it. That does it. And then when here came this man who was looming on my horizon as a prospective husband, I thought, no way could God want this. This is not a gift from God. And so when he proposed, I told him he would have to wait for an answer. And during those weeks of prayer and waiting on God, one of the verses that God gave me was from 1 Corinthians 12. Men have different gifts, but it is the same Lord who accomplishes his purposes through them all. There is a purpose in this particular union. There is a special reason for God's gift of this particular man. You marry a man, you marry a sinner. And don't forget, he married a sinner too. He is stuck with a sinner. And if a sinful man and a sinful woman are going to live together 365 days a year, there is going to be a great deal of need for long-suffering, patience, good humor, forgiveness, and grace with a capital G. We are heirs together of the grace of God. Let me mention the gift of motherhood in this context. And this to me is a perfect illustration of what I said a few moments ago. Our goal is not fulfillment. Nowadays we hear women encouraged to take a few months off from their executive job to have a baby because they might find fulfillment in having a child, the fulfillment that they thought they were going to find in this high-powered, high-paying job, which turns out not to be there after all. They might find it in having a baby, and so they quit their job with the assurance that they will be able to get it back again, or they will sue, and they go about finding fulfillment by getting themselves pregnant. What could be further from the purpose of God and the Spirit of Christ? The mother, the real mother, loves that child with everything in her, loves that child as she never imagined before the child was born she could possibly love a little child. I was never one to grab and kiss and hug and make over other people's babies. But I found out when God gave me my own that I was seething with all kinds of tremendously powerful emotions that I didn't know existed. And I loved that child, and I took care of that child, never even once thinking that it was going to give me fulfillment. That was not my goal. My goal was the good of that child. My goal was my love, my motivation. The driving energy of my life was love. Is motherhood fulfilling? Not in itself, any more than marriage. Where do we find fulfillment? In receiving the gifts from God, in saying thank you, in offering them back to Him, and thus establishing this perpetual chain of gift, receiving, thanksgiving, and offering. God's gift, my receiving, my thanksgiving, and my offering. And this is the cycle of my life. Motherhood ought not to be on our agenda of self-actualization. God help us all if we have such an agenda. Motherhood is perhaps one of the greatest of all human gifts. A glorious gift. Mary, that supreme example to all of us of what motherhood is about, said that she was blessed above anything that she could imagine. That beautiful song that she sang when she went to visit her cousin Elizabeth expresses her praise for the privilege that was hers. And then she was called blessed among all women, most highly exalted, because she was willing to be somebody's mother and to give up all her own plans and purposes, all her own desires and hopes when that dazzling visitor came suddenly into that little village house with his announcement. Her response was not, but wait a minute, what about Joseph? Wait a minute, what about my plans? Wait a minute, what will the people say? How will I ever prove to them that I've not been unfaithful? What was her response? Behold the handmaid of the Lord. Let it happen as you say. That should be the response of every woman and every man to God. Behold the handmaiden, or behold the manservant. Let it happen. Anything you say, Lord, I'll take it. Mary could not possibly have known the price that she was going to have to pay. No mother can know that. And as someone has said, if there were such a thing as the memory of pain, there would never have been a second child born in the world. By the grace of God, by the mercy of God, we forget how bad it was, and we have another baby. But there was a far greater pain for Mary than childbirth. And old Simeon told her in that prophetic word when the baby was only 8 days old, "A sword shall pierce thine own soul." And then we find Mary standing at the cross of Jesus. I love that word. There stood by the cross of Jesus Mary, his mother. She wasn't in a crumpled heap. There she stood, strong, undoubtedly torn when that sword pierced her soul, but strong because she had learned obedience, and her response was obedience. The last gift that I want to mention is the one that certainly no married woman would ever choose, widowhood. And 27 months after I married Jim Elliott, God gave me a gift, the third gift of widowhood, from singleness to marriage to widowhood. I didn't want that gift. I was quite sure that the one thing that I could never survive would be the loss of this man for whom I had waited 5.5 years. And God gave to us on our wedding day the verse in Isaiah, "Lo, this is our God. We have waited for him." And when the word came to me that Jim was dead, the words that God brought to my mind at that time, I told you, I think last night, that he had brought to my mind the words of Isaiah 43:2 when I learned that he was missing. Forgive me if it wasn't last night that I told you this. It might have been yesterday noon in Greenville. I never know quite what I've said where. But just right now I wanted to tell you the words that came to my mind when I learned that he was dead for sure after 5 days of waiting to find out. They were from a poem that I had memorized many years before by F.W.H. Myers, the final stanza of his poem, St. Paul. "So through life, death, through sorrow and through sinning, Christ shall suffice me, for he hath sufficed. Christ is the end, for Christ was the beginning. Christ the beginning, for the end is Christ. My goal is Christ, not fulfillment." And so when God takes away that which is most precious in my eyes, let me remember that it was only a gift. It was God's gift. I had offered it back to him, and he had the right, he had total right to withdraw that gift in order to teach me new lessons, in order to take me through yet another wilderness experience, that I might be hungry, that I might say, "Yes, Lord." Another prayer that I had prayed was from a poem by Amy Carmichael. "Lord crucified, O mark thy holy cross on motive, preference, all fond desires, on that which self in any form inspires. Set thou that sign of loss. And when the touch of death is here and there laid on a thing most precious in our eyes, let us not wonder. Let us recognize the answer to our prayer." Have you ever prayed, "Thy will be done"? And when God set about doing it, were you surprised? Did you say, "Why"? Think about it. God can transform me through this very thing that empties my hands, that empties my home, that breaks my heart, that devastates me, if I will receive it, accept it, and give thanks. I offer it back to God, my singleness, my marriage, my widowhood, and I would not want to leave out your divorce, if that's your situation. You cannot undo that, whether it was your fault or his fault or both of your faults or somebody else's fault. This is today, and it is here in this very place that God wants to speak to you, to teach you to trust him, to say, even this thing, can it possibly be of any good? Can God ever transform this thing for the good of a multitude? No, he can't unless you receive it, accept it, face the reality, and offer it back to God. Christians ought to be the people most ready to face reality. And yet how evasive we are. How many people came up to me after my husband died and said something about my husband passing away? Now, isn't that just plain silly for a Christian? He didn't pass away. He was caught up to glory. He died, as far as I'm concerned. He's gone, period. I'm not going to see him again, not in the flesh. Not going to sleep with him again. Not going to be able to feel that body that I knew every inch of. That's the reality. The Christian looks at the visible world and recognizes that the whole interpretation of what we see is in the unseen world, the invisible. I say to you, look higher. Don't be looking at your circumstances and feeling so sorry for yourself and having a little pity party and sitting down and wallowing in a heap of misery. Look higher. Lift up your heart. Lift up your hands. Receive the gift. Thank him. And then go on, and you will be freed to serve other people. Oh God, prayed Sir Patterson, make us masters of ourselves, that we may be the servants of others. God bless you.